I'm Tim Ventura from AmericanAntiGravity.com, and this is interview number 2 with David Sereda on the topic of his galaxy clock model of gravity, UFOs, and a number of other interesting and related topics. Well, David, in our last session, you were really describing the model of this galaxy clock theory of physics, and I think in this one I'd like to start out by touching on how this can be applied to human spacecraft engineering.
Well, actually, last summer I lectured at the Mutual UFO Network conference in Denver, and it's amazing when you go to these UFO conferences because even this just a few months ago I spoke at the X conference in Washington D.C. and you're sitting next to U.S. Army physicists who are studying this stuff, NASA, heads of propulsion divisions are there, and they've approached me about my theory, and they're interested in reducing inertial mass increases and reducing the effects of gravity. They're very taking a liking to that concept. But without naming names, I can only say that all I heard is that we are not getting enough funding in these areas. Advanced propulsion concepts are just really getting money to push paperwork, to write ideas down, and to put them on the chalkboard. So I believe we're making a huge mistake in this country. Well, in Russia and China and even Iran, they're studying the UFO phenomena in their universities. And even India, their propulsion labs are working on anti-gravity concepts. The next person or country who figures out anti-gravity is going to rule the airspace on this planet. The F-18 fighter jet and the F-22 are going to be obsolete. You're even talking about the ability to produce invisibility for craft when you can change the frequency of matter. You can cause it to go invisible, and which is true stealth. So, firstly, there is a huge void out there in funding. So, in order to actually start, doing experimental models, I've come up with wave generator designs that I would have to work with a team of engineers to build, to test. And some of these, projects would initially be in the millions of, upwards of $10 million range, 5 to 10 million. And then, if we could get produce consistent results in duplicating the Hutchison effect. The Hutchison effect employs the very same ideas I'm talking about. John Hutchison strobes a 75-pound cannonball with a series of waves that progresses from lower frequency to higher frequency, which in theory, I believe if you're in phase synchronicity with your base wave, your very low, ultra-low frequency graviton state, and then you raise its frequency, mass will transform and gravity will have less effect on it because you're decreasing the mass gravity effect by increasing the frequency of mass. But sometimes the Hutchison effect doesn't work, and that's because I think his wave generator is out of phase at the base level of the graviton. So first, what I would do is fund my paperwork and film work to build a model to show the search for the graviton and where I think it is, and to work with physicists to actually identify the precise, all the 5 dimensions of a wave: amplitude, wavelength, frequency, and spin velocity, and to determine, exactly the state of the graviton. And once you can determine all the aspects of the wave state of the graviton, you build a wave generator that duplicates that exact state. And I know how to build a wave generator to do that. And if you read my papers, it's almost staring you right in the face, but I'm not going to come out and actually say it exactly how you do it. So what happened is NASA approached me and said, well, if we could get some funding, Congress is not putting funding into these ideas. NASA would be interested in following the experiments to see what kind of results we can produce. And if there's even a slight reduction in the mass gravity effect, it would prove the concept to bring in more funding to develop it further and further. So it's going to take Joe Firmage or Bill Gates or Paul Allen or somebody to take a liking to this stuff, or even George Lucas or Spielberg to drop some money into the pot and get this stuff going.
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the things that the Hollywood community can really identify with is the media value of your work. This is compelling material, and I really think it relates to the future of mankind and the future of mankind's space
Mm,
program. And so
mm.
in that context, if nothing else, it has a tremendous amount of value just in kind of keeping the public's morale up about where we're going in space.
Well, what Kennedy started, I mean, really, to me, he was the greatest president when you consider that back then we were nowhere near as advanced in science as we are today, and he took us to the moon on several Apollo missions. We haven't been to the moon since Kennedy's space program ended. I mean, here we are orbiting around the Earth, in very successful space shuttle missions, but we're not even talking about going back to the moon or going to Mars, seriously going to Mars, except for in the far, far distant future. Kennedy didn't put things in the future. He said, let's do them right now. UFOs beckon us right now with advanced technology, and if you study them, and you will always see these waves strobing around their craft, and you slow the waves down and you translate what the waves are trying to tell you, I believe that the only theory in physics that can explain their movements, their sudden accelerations, sudden stops, angular turns, their translucency, even the Phoenix Lights incidents, for example. Eyewitnesses, this was in 1997, it was all over the news. Even the city councilwoman, Frances Barwood, went public to talk about the Phoenix Lights. There was a formation of what appeared to be a formation of lights from the northern end of the Arizona state moving south and then heading into Phoenix. People saw this thing across the state, but eyewitnesses in rural neighborhoods said that it was not a formation. It was one craft, because when you looked up at it, it was like translucent mass that you could see through, but you could definitely see it had mass. You could barely see the stars on the other side, whereas next to it you could clearly see the stars. And then you could see, I remember this young little boy saying you could see the waves, actual waves strobing through the translucent mass. Now when you look at the NASA UFOs, in evidence the case for NASA UFOs, you'll see waves strobing through translucent mass. And mass starts to go translucent when its mass gravity effect is reducing. Then this last spring, we had the Mexican UFO case. We had the Mexican military release footage in the infrared of what appeared to be 11 UFOs that surrounded their drug surveillance aircraft. They were using advanced target, it's called forward-looking advanced target infrared. And forward-looking infrared basically is a $400,000 infrared camera that fuses longer and shorter wavelengths of the infrared to give a much clearer picture in the infrared. And then when they saw these, what appeared to be objects that they could not see with the naked eye, with ocular confirmation as pilots, they started sending radar at it, and the radar passed through 8 of the 11, and 3 of them they got a radar echo return, but the other 8 they did not. So that means they're in a very low mass state. When your craft its mass is reduced so much that it's pretty much translucent mass. Photons, microwave photons, just pass right through it, so you don't get a radar return signal because it's not solid. And that's what the NASA UFOs look like. So when you understand the concept of reducing the mass gravity effect and mass becoming so low that it becomes translucent, and then eventually it starts to vibrate in such high frequencies that you can't even see it, because we only see wavelengths from red to violet, and ultraviolet near, ultraviolet far, and ultraviolet extreme are far beyond the capacity of the human eye. You would need special cameras to see those signals. And that looking for advanced UFO craft, you shouldn't always be looking for this physical metallic ship. You should be looking for light signatures.
Sure. Well, the thing that I like about your approach is that you have a good nuts and bolts approach to the reverse engineering UFO technology. And I think that it's becoming more of a rarity these days. So many people are going towards the metaphorical aspects. There are crystal charmers out there trying to psychically communicate with ET, which, who knows? It may or may not work. But the thing that we really have a grasp on is that we see their technology. That's the thing that we have photos of. What I was going to say about the Mexican incident, interestingly enough, I have it on good information that U.S. radar also picked that up. Our drug interdiction radar saw some of those UFOs.
Yeah, they saw some of them, and I have sources in the military that said that they were tracking them from South America into Central America and then into Mexico. So they followed them for a long time. We were picking them up. We actually have. I got a call from a guy after Evidence the Case for NASA UFOs came out, and I pretty much introduced the invisibility concept and proved that NASA was looking in the ultraviolet and the infrared as well as visible wavelengths. This guy called me up from Space Command, and he said, in Space Command, we have satellites observing Earth 24 hours a day in all the spectrum of light. And he said, we see these things in the UV cameras all the time. So you can imagine Space Command probably saw the objects coming in, and they saw them in South America. They probably even saw them coming in from outer space. And they were tracking them. And I imagine the Mexican military got a call, go and check out this, coordinates, and see what you can find, and they don't find anything except for in the invisible. And then they sent radar at it, and most of the radar failed. There was one report that said they were oil rigs, and the infrared signature was coming off of the oil rigs down in the ocean. Had they been oil rigs, the microwave radiation or photons would have bounced off the steel structure on the oil rigs, and you would have definitely seen all of them on radar, but you didn't. And that means, and also they were flying at 13,000 feet, so they're obviously not looking straight down at the ocean. They were off to the side.
Oh, sure,
straight,
sure.
90 degrees straight out. So they're obviously not down in the lower atmosphere. But what I propose is if the craft are vibrating in the ultraviolet spectrum, because ultraviolet light will transfer some of its energy into the humidity of the atmosphere. And according to the report in Mexico, the humidity was very high, and the background temperature was very cold because you're at high altitude. When you're up at 13,000 feet, things cool down a lot. So you get a good signal-to-noise ratio. You get a heat transfer from ultraviolet. That heats up the humidity. The background is cold. So on an infrared camera, you get a nice image. It's a good contrast. You get the heat signature contrast against the background of the atmosphere. So you can see them in infrared, but you're not really seeing the UFO. You're just seeing the imprint it's leaving on the atmosphere.
Yeah, now if that's the case, though, you might have a little bit of bubbling in the atmosphere, almost like the invisibility device in the movie Predator.
Right. Exactly. You will get this plasma effect when you have the transfer of the electromagnetic energy from the craft to our atmosphere.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'd like to come back and talk a little bit about is energy, because I think that one of the assumptions traditionally has been that the 0-point energy source is really going to be the power source for anti-gravity craft. And I would be really happy if that turns out to be the case, but, for first or second generation devices, I think we also need to be a little bit concerned about how much juice we're going to have to provide these things with to get them off the ground. Now,
okay.
Well, in the case of UFOs, these are aircraft-sized devices, or even, let's assume it's a football field or larger sized. That's still not the same thing as the kind of particle accelerators that we work with on the ground. So I think we could make some assumptions from UFOs that these are achievable mobile power sources. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what it's actually going to take to power these things.
Well, see, again, you need an initial burst of energy to affect a large amount of mass, and that's why I think Lazar's element 115 is very much an integral part of the equation, but you only need the energy burst for a fraction of a second, because the wave generator will process that huge amount of energy from element 115, and it will spin it up to a higher frequency state where the mass of the craft is going to reduce, and the amount of energy required becomes less and less and less, to the point that when your mass reaches zero, in Einstein's equation, energy is equal to mass times the speed of light squared. If your mass is zero, the energy requirement in relation to the speed of light squared is zero.
Well,
so what 0-point energy tells you is that if you, usually in 0-point energy devices, you see an increase in voltage, which is flow, and a decrease in amperage, which is punch. And you can't affect a lot of mass with a low amplitude current unless you reduce the mass gravity effect down, and then when mass is entering the 0-point field itself and its mass gravity effect is reducing, then the 0-point field becomes very useful. Then it will have a profound effect on mass. The two are coming together. But drawing energy out of the 0 point and transferring it to mass, usually you get a very weak amplitude wave, and that's what Hutchison is finding out. He's finding out that he can produce very weak amplitude currents out of the zero field and run tiny little lights and little fans. But the way a gravity generator would work in the current physics models is they can see the energy there in the equation in the 0 point, but they don't know how to extract it.
You know,
I've seen many 0 point energy devices where even Harvard and Stanford physicists are amazed because they can measure the energy gain in the field, but they can't see how to transfer it from the field to move something mechanically.
Well, I'd
and
like to
that's
touch.
why I think the equation is wrong.
I'd like to touch on the element 115 really quickly before we move on. I've actually heard of two different rumors. You know, the conventional story that Lazar has told is that it's actually the element 115 that apparently loses a proton and gives off a gamma ray in the process. But as it turns out, the military, at least the rumor goes, has been experimenting with a nuclear isomer with a weight of 115. So it's not element 115, but it has the same weight. And I guess the idea has been that by hitting this with a laser, they're able to create a stimulated decay reaction. So what they've actually created is a throttleable nuclear reaction for something like a thermoelectric generator. And that might actually be a useful approach also, literally being able to put a control throttle on how much energy you're producing via a nuclear power source.
Yeah, if you can, like the same thing Earl Van Lanningham said to me at NASA about using antiprotons out of nuclear fusion reactors such as helium-3, is that you can control the amount of protons that stream out so that you don't suddenly accelerate to these enormous velocities. You do it very slowly. And if you can control, that's a good idea. But I think, we're very mechanistic people. We see heavy things, we want to lift heavy things, we want to transport heavy things. So we think in terms of how much energy it takes to move things around. Because that's what we do with energy. We move cars, we transport foods, we lift things with cranes to make buildings. But when you consider even the pyramids in Egypt, if they could reduce the mass of the stones, and they could levitate them with absolute ease.
Yeah,
so the energy curve goes down as you reduce the mass gravity effect. The curve goes down for propulsion, the energy required to move it at greater and greater velocities. So that is the answer to me in the missing part of the equation in 0 point energy, is that if you reduce the mass gravity effect, the 0 point field becomes more and more effective on mass. But if you're going to keep mass in its current state, the 0 point field, you'll find the energy there, and there is a transfer, but the amplitude is very weak.
Sure.
You can't do much with it.
Well, so it's almost in terms of reducing the mass of the spacecraft, both inertial and gravitational, down to something like nearly zero, means that these minimal fluctuations in the 0 point field can actually be made useful. So it's like putting...
Exactly my point.
Yeah. It's almost like if you can reduce that mass effect down that low, something like a bottle rocket might be able to give you tremendous speeds. Even for a massive
anything.
spacecraft.
I mean, really small bursts, and I mean even when your mass is really low, and I never believe in absolute zeros on either end of the spectrum, but what happens is the very low amplitude signals from the brain can tell the craft to go left or right or stop or turn, because brainwave produces very weak, low amplitude signals that can only affect a low mass state, such as the experiments that were represented in the movie What the Bleep, when the observer interacts with water. The photographs from Dr. Yamamoto showed that if you were angry, the water, when you froze it, the crystalline structure would be very chaotic, and when you played heavy metal, it would do the same, and then when you said to the water, "I love you," it would have this beautiful formation. So what that shows is that the brain wave can actually, the observer, this is the whole problem with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, is the observer affects the observed. So the human brain wave is affecting the observer, but when the human brain wave is interfaced with a craft of very low mass, it can affect it. It can tell it what to do.
Sure. I've always gone the other direction, though. I've always thought that UFO occupants, wherever they're from, whatever they may be, are advanced enough that they probably use IT technologies, direct mind interface to the control systems.
Exactly. Yeah.
They may have even grown. We think in terms of implants to communicate with
Mhm.
computers, but they may have even grown that into their own minds. So,
Well, they grew it right into their minds because they would eventually become one with their craft. I mean, they're almost their interface is so close. I mean, you can do two things. If you can only reduce 50% of the mass of a craft, which would significantly reduce the cost of fuel to launch the space shuttle, if you could even reduce it by 50%, well, you can have the pilot or astronaut, their brainwaves, you can amp up the signal from their brainwaves to, interface with the computer on the craft.
well, yourself and Dan Aykroyd, I'm sure, have talked about this a number of times. I know that he is a big UFO advocate, as you are yourself. And one of the things I'm wondering is whether or not you guys have arrived at any good conclusions, especially, again, coming at it from the nuts and bolts perspective, about where these craft are from and why they're here.
Well, where they're from, there's a surprise in the end of Evidence the Case for NASA UFOs. Those particular UFOs, we build a case, and it's a case, so that means the audience can decide, whether, the hypothesis has any validity, but we match it to a star system, a legendary star system.
Oh, okay. So they're well. Dan had also talked about extra dimensionals, which is something. Actually, if I can ever get him on the show for an interview, I would love to cover that in more detail. But that doesn't that kind of presume that they may actually be from here, just another dimension.
Well, really, when you transform mass, ultimately, it does enter under dimensions. And the most advanced thing I'm working on right now is a derivative from the Don Hodson paper on Dirac's equation in a sea of negative energy, parts 1 and 2, which gets into this theory that there is this sea that permeates the entire universe of singularity, or everything either spins negative in that sea or positive, but in his case he calls it the sea of negative energy. Now, what causes inertia, resistance, the very fact that light is traveling so slow, because light is not instantaneous over vast distances. The distance between our galaxy and Andromeda is 2.5 to 2.9 million light years. So light, it takes 2.5 million years to get here from there. That's way too slow as far as using that as a form of measurement for relativity in intergalactic terms. In even galactic terms, it takes our galaxy is 100,000 light years across. It's too slow. So the sea of negative energy proposes that, why, for example, light is traveling so slow is light is a waveform that's moving through another waveform, which is the background of space, and that causes inertia, resistance. It pushes against it. Even though light in itself is the only particle we know of that's singular, it spins positive, and that it doesn't have an antiparticle. This is very interesting when you get into the philosophy of this. I mean, even religiously, when Adam and Eve partook of the proverbial knowledge of good and evil is a duality. It's positive and negative spinning against each other. And what it represents is conflict. Because the two oppose each other, they cancel out the overall force because they've had a competition against each other and they've wasted all of that energy. And that's why what I call the differential, the leftover energy between one force and another, is so small, it's so weak. Well, all atoms are bound in dual pairs. You have, quarks, antiquarks, you have, proton, antiproton, neutron, antineutron. Everything has a dual pair. And those dual pairs are like battles. Now, Jesus said, if thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be filled with light. Well, amazingly, Jesus wasn't a physicist in his day, but light is the only singly charged particle we know of. But while it's a singly charged particle, I believe that is the main reason it can accelerate to what we know of as the speed of light, 186,282 miles per second, which is 670 million miles an hour. That seems fast and instantaneous over short distances, and it's good for local relativity theory, but in galactic terms, it's too slow. But why is light going so slow? Is because it's competing against another waveform, which is the medium it's moving through. Now, in singularity, an entire sea of singularity, everything that enters the sea becomes single. It can't exist in opposing to it. A duality has to exist in a lower dimension of the universe. When you enter singularity, you cannot be a duality, because a conflict, for example, in a metaphorical sense, imagine oneness or singularity is a state of love, and a state of love is defined as a state of union where there's no conflict. But a conflict can't exist in singularity or in the state of love. It's a lower vibration, so it falls out. That's what I believe is the reason God was saying that we should never partake of the knowledge of good and evil, because it's conflict. And if a million people take in the knowledge of good and evil, they'll all define it differently.
Sure.
And therefore, they'll always be opposed to each other. And then you get wars and you get arguments, and everyone has their unique viewpoint, but it ends up causing violence. But when you become single and you enter a sea of singularity, there's no inertia. Everything is instantaneous, and that's what Dirac says in this paper. And this paper was rejected by the established community, and Dirac died, I think, in 1984, Paul Dirac, but his paper is a legacy now. It's kind of an underground paper that people can read it at zeitlin.net, zeitlin.net. And you can scroll down on the left-hand side and you can see parts 1 and 2 of this incredibly profound paper. Now, what is so amazing about singularity is it may be the first paper in physics to prove, first, why the cosmic background microwave radiation of the universe has an evenly distributed temperature, and the Big Bang cannot answer that. Because in the sea of negative energy, everything is instantaneously transformed or transmitted. All the dual pairs are born out of it, and they enter the physical universe, and then when they expire, they go back into singularity. But in singularity, which spans the entire universe, if you entered it, any point in the universe is attainable in zero time, because there's no time in an instantaneous plane. I mean, literally, any distance, absolutely instantaneous. So if you could become single as a spaceship, enter the sea of singularity, and reinsert yourself back into the matrix of the four-dimensional universe, there's no time, and there's no distance, and you can move through time. You can do anything, and it's the ultimate theory, because I believe it proves the existence of God, the highest force, the only force that is truly beyond space and time.
Sure. Well, on that note, we're out of time again for today, but I should restate your website URL at www.ufonasa.com, where you're selling a copy of the documentary entitled Evidence, The Case for NASA UFOs, featuring Dan Aykroyd, and selling for $24.95. Also, the paper that we've been discussing is entitled Advanced Aerospace Propulsion, a New Theoretical and Experimental Approach, and I have a PDF copy of that online in American Anti-Gravity. And it definitely sounds like you're looking at building some of the grassroots efforts that we've been working with online. So, welcome to the community, and it's great to have you aboard. And I think we're all moving in the same direction, so it's been a wonderful chance to hear some of your thoughts and the direction that you're going with on your research.
Thank you very much, Tim. We'll do more together, I'm sure.
Thanks again.